This is Principles of Ecosystem Ecology. Chapter 9. Nutrient Cycling. Nutrient cycling involves nutrient inputs to and outputs from ecosystems, and their internal transfers of nutrients within the ecosystems. Chapter 9 covers the basics of nutrient cycling. Human impacts on nutrient cycles have fundamentally altered the regulation of ecosystem processes. As we talked about before, when thinking about limitation, we know that nutrients are a key regulator of ecosystems. A number of processes are limited by the availability of nutrients. When we add nutrients, we see increases in productivity, shifts in species composition, changes in gas flux. As a society, we've been increasing the supplies of nutrients on a global scale. The ability to fix atmospheric nitrogen and then apply that to ecosystems, such as agricultural systems, has fundamentally changed the functioning of these ecosystems. So here, it's not atypical in systems, agricultural systems, so this would be a cornfield that's getting ready to be plowed, where ammonia fertilizer is added, and large quantities of N are taken from the atmosphere, fixed, and then added to ecosystems. When this is done on a local scale, it might have a local effect, but when the extent of fertilization reaches global scales, we see that there are global consequences to the addition of fertilizers. This is the map of global nitrogen fertilizer application. The scale for this map is in kilograms per hectare of nitrogen fertilizer added. So kilograms per hectare is the same as 1 kilogram per hectare is the same as 0.1 grams per meter squared. So if you divide these numbers by 10, you get a pretty good idea in grams per meter squared of how much nitrogen is being added. And this is not necessarily universal, but a reasonable breakpoint between a low nitrogen system and a high nitrogen system, systems where nitrogen are really added in excess, is somewhere over here on the order of 40 kilograms per hectare or 4 grams of N per meter squared per year. So if you just look for the yellow to orange systems, that's really where nitrogen is being added. So nitrogen is being added throughout the world for all intents and purposes, but some places it's really being added at higher levels than others. I'm not singling out any one particular area here, but you can see that there are some parts of the world that are really receiving a lot of nitrogen. The consequences of all this nitrogen application is not necessarily easy to determine. To understand the global consequences of nitrogen enrichment, we're going to work to try and understand the local consequences. What that means is understanding nutrient cycling. We've already covered some of the aspects of nutrient cycling, but in this chapter, we're going to go more into the nutrient cycles themselves to try and understand the consequences, for example, of additional amounts of nutrients being added to a system. The authors offer a few focal points to think more about nutrients and their importance within society. They state that nutrient runoff from freshwater systems to the ocean has created or intensified dead zones in 2/3 of the world's estuaries. So we had the example of Lake Erie, where phosphorus of late has been added to ecosystems here, and a small portion of that runs off into the Maumee River and then enters into Lake Erie. This is a relatively shallow system, and we get high productivity of phytoplankton in the western portion of the lake. That same idea happens in coastal systems, where nutrients are added into these shallow waters, and here they come out the Mississippi, which is draining a large area of agricultural land throughout the upper Midwest and the central part of the US. When those nutrients and sediments exit into the water, they're going to cause large increases in productivity. So here, red represents high areas of phytoplankton and sediments. This is where productivity is really the highest. When you get these high levels of productivity in these waters, that might be good in the short term, but in the long term, it's going to require a lot of oxygen as they die, decompose, and require oxygen for that decomposition. These areas become anoxic in portions of the year. With that anoxia, you have large fish kills that happen, for example. This is another satellite image of the same system, really showing you here in natural color the dense profusion of phytoplankton growth that you can get in these nearshore ecosystems, all being driven by excess nitrogen and phosphorus coming through the Mississippi River. So when we look at these systems, we know that nutrients increase production in aquatic systems. But that increase in production requires an increase in decomposition. And that reduces oxygen levels. So knowing that reduced oxygen levels are not beneficial in aquatic systems, there's questions about how these systems can be managed better. So ecosystem ecologists have been asked, how can these effects be reduced by more careful management of nutrient sources in agricultural lands and cities? So we know that agricultural lands and cities too are placing a large amount of nutrient into the rivers and streams that eventually drain out into the Gulf of Mexico. Ecosystem ecologists are being asked to better understand how we can reduce that loading into the shallow waters. Another question is, how can fertilizer applications be matched with crop nutrient demands to reduce fertilizer requirements and reduce offsite impacts of pollution? Simply adding nutrients into an agricultural system is not necessarily going to lead to large losses to aquatic systems. But if we take a look at the demand of nutrients by plants, it tends to grow over the course of the year and then at a certain point stop. If we take a look at the pattern by which nutrients are often applied, it might be over here somewhere. So the nutrients are applied during a time when demand by crops is relatively low. This generates a temporal excess of nutrients being available, and this is when a lot of the losses occur. So ecosystem ecologists, along with agronomists and other scientists, have been working to think about different ways to apply nutrients into agricultural systems to better match the demand of plants, so you don't generate as much loss from the system into aquatic ecosystems. Lastly, the authors didn't mention this specifically, but it's important to think about the consequences of nutrient addition for terrestrial ecosystems, and not necessarily the crop systems that we're adding, for example, nitrogen to, but we'll learn and go into a little bit more detail when we add nitrogen to systems and there's excess nitrogen in the soils relative to demand, that a portion of that nitrogen is lost to the atmosphere. And that can travel downwind and then come and rain down onto terrestrial systems. And a lot of terrestrial systems that are downwind of those agricultural systems that have a lot of nitrogen being applied are experiencing elevated nitrogen deposition. The consequences of that aren't necessarily bad per se, but we're still learning about what they are. In many places, there's been a lot of eutrophication in terrestrial ecosystems that were readily apparent, but there's also a lot of systems that haven't experienced eutrophication. And it's a good, firm understanding of the nitrogen cycle is required to determine what the effects are in downwind ecosystems.